Hey everyone. This video is a continuation of my series on mental illness and Scientology. Recently, with Scientology TV now being a thing, Scientology is really trying to spread the word about how bad psychiatry is and psychology is, and how Scientology has cornered the market on handling mental illness or problems people have, issues people have. And yet when you dive into Scientology's policies, you find that they will not treat mental illness and that sort of thing, as we've discussed in earlier videos in this series. Now what we're going to do is get into talking about something called the Introspection Rundown. And there's a whole thing to this, and it's quite an interesting and detailed and involved thing that we're going to be talking about. Before we get into the details of that, there were a couple points I wanted to make about this. You know, something about, there's nothing funny about mental illness or about mental disorders. And anybody who might have had a poor reaction to the fact that, you know, there was some laughter in earlier, you know, in my earlier video about this, that is sort of the fact that that Sunny Pereira, the person I'm going to be speaking with here, and myself are also former members of Scientology, and it's not a humorous kind of laughing that we're getting into when we're talking about this stuff, but we will try to keep the tone here appropriate for the material. Scientology does not take mental illness seriously at all. They actually don't even believe that any of the classifications or disorders or illnesses that are laid out in psychiatry exist. They think it all comes down to one single source, and it's a very simple handling, and all you got to do is deal with this thing called the reactive mind, and everything will be wonderful and peachy and great. And if that worked out in the real world, I would be singing Scientology's praises from the highest rooftops. I actually would. Having worked for it for 27 years, I know that exactly the opposite is true. And that's why I've been taking the time to put these videos out here about this subject, because I don't want anybody making the mistake of falling for Scientology's pseudoscientific nonsense as an alternative, as thinking that that's a good thing to do rather than go see a trained professional. Which is not to say that psychiatry has all the answers or psychology has everything figured out, because they don't. But at least they're actually honestly working and trying, whereas Scientology is really just about taking your money. That being said, another thing that as to why we're getting into talking about this thing called the Introspection Rundown is it was positioned by L. Ron Hubbard as sort of the ultimate handling for psychosis and for mental illness. And he said that the Introspection Rundown solved the reason why psychiatry exists. Well, we're going to show, and we've already been showing in this series, that that's not true. That's not the case. But that is why we have been discussing this in such detail. And finally, the last little thing I wanted to say here about this is that while we're going to be talking about the details and steps of this introspection rundown and what this is all about and how Scientology deals with mental illnesses and disorders, none of what we are talking about here is any endorsement or recommendation to do any part of this. You know, when we talk about this stuff, we're talking about or describing what L. Ron Hubbard has put out there and what Scientologists have done in order to try to use or apply what L. Ron Hubbard wrote. You know, so when we're talking about cases, or we're talking about whether there were successes or failures or this or that, don't mistake any of this for you know, anything like we think this is something that should be done, because we don't. All right, so we're now going to get into this in earnest. So I am now joined by Sunny Pereira. She was a highly trained former Scientologist and Sea Org member who administered introspection rundowns on a number of cases. And in addition to introspection rundowns, also administered all kinds of Scientology processes and techniques on, I don't know, Sunny, would you say hundreds, thousands of different cases of individuals?
Thousands. I would say thousands of different cases, yes, over the years. From like 94 to 2004, about 10 years of case supervisor duties.
Okay, good. So pretty experienced when it comes to applying L. Ron Hubbard's techniques to others and seeing whether it works and whether it doesn't, what produced results and what didn't, how long the benefits of any of Hubbard's processes lasted for people. And of course, Sunny is very knowledgeable, more than I am on some of these technical issues, which is why I'm so happy that that we're able to do this. So thank you, Sunny.
Sure, no problem.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this now. We're going to head into it, but before we go into the steps of this thing called the Introspection Rundown, we have some groundwork to lay first. Where should we start?
I wanted to just show. I actually found in my photos a photograph of me in the CS office at CC, and I wanted to show this to you.
Sure.
So people can get an idea what a CS office is. Let's see if I can get that centered.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So that's me, based on that uniform. That means that was probably around 1996 or 97.
Okay.
And that's the CS office at CC. You can see the Hubbard materials behind me. Those folders on there are PC folders on my desk.
Just to clear up, let's clear up a couple things real fast. CC is
Sure.
Celebrity Center International in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And of course, the first question anybody's going to ask when they find out that you were a case supervisor at CC International is, did you CS celebrities?
That's classified.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. It's going to be a question people are going to ask. We're not going to get into any details.
When someone comes in newly, when there's a new person coming into Celebrity Center, that was me. I was the one who got those files. Yes.
Okay.
To answer that. Me saying that's classified was a joke.
Yeah. Okay, good. Cool. All right. And yeah, those folders there are pre-clear folders, PC folders. Those are people who are being audited in Scientology, receiving Scientology counseling. It's a poor choice of words, by the way, counseling, because it's not, we have to draw analogies, and sometimes we have to stretch pretty hard. Scientology auditing isn't psychological counseling. They're not the same thing, but it's the only thing we can use as a word to try to communicate some kind of concept of what's going on in an auditing session.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we could try to just use the word sessions. I don't know if that would communicate well enough.
Totally fine. Yeah.
I was going to try to switch to that as best as I could, but I understand the concern with using the word. Anyway, the other thing about that CS office is you can see there's a television in that photograph, and that television is not for watching television. That is direct access to sessions that are being delivered. I could watch a session live on that television if I wanted to, any of them that are going on anywhere in the organization. There were some that were on the second floor, some that were on the first floor, and some that were back down in the president's office. All of them are connected to that television. So
right. And that's
the look-in system that they have.
Yeah, they call it the look-listen system, because you can watch, and you can also, they'll often have microphones in the room so you can hear what's going on too.
Yes, and a lot of them have microphones where you can actually speak to the auditor and give them instructions.
Wow, like through an earpiece.
Yes.
The person receiving the auditing doesn't hear the instructions.
No.
Right, just to be clear about that. Now also, and that's another example of why it's not, it's stretching the analogy to call it counseling, because generally speaking, I think unless you're in some sort of an experimental situation where you're being overseen as a part of a study, I can't think of any reason why you would have a psychologist or a psychiatrist having somebody else looking in on their sessions with patients.
Right.
So, yeah, but that's a standard practice in Scientology, and it could happen in almost any session, any location, at any time.
Yeah, I mean, later they set up the system where it's computerized and all sessions are available for up to 6 months. They get deleted after 6 months, but you don't even have to record them anymore. They used to be VHS, and now they're computerized, so everything is available.
Wow.
The other thing I wanted to bring up, I mean, I know a lot of people already know that I have had my training, but I'm just going to show you this. I don't have my certificates anymore. I did actually leave with them, but I don't have them anymore. I got rid of them. This is the Scientology passport. which has a little book. It's a little booklet, and it's really thick. And it has a list of everything that Scientology offers, all services. So this page shows that I don't know if you can see that. That shows the St. Hill Special Briefing Course.
Yep.
That is the Class 6, and this shows the completion of Class 6. Can you see that? And it shows that I finished it. I finished that training, and that's the training that you need to do this.
Oh, good point. Yeah, you were classified as a Hubbard Senior Scientologist.
Dukes of the Auditor Elite.
That's right.
That's what they call us.
That's right, the Dukes of the Auditor Elite. Okay, good. So, all right, so let's get into this now. So what, I think we're starting with this PTS conditions, this type 3 thing. This is a term that's used.
Sure, we can talk about the PTS conditions. There's 3 types of PTS conditions, PTS type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1 is a potential trouble source. It is someone who is connected to a suppressive person in their current situation. It's somebody in their life right now who is actively suppressing them or stopping them from making progress or being happy in their life.
Okay, so for like if my mom didn't want me doing Scientology and was giving me a hard time all the time and was nagging me and criticizing Scientology, telling me how horrible it was and how I was wasting my money and wasting my life doing that sort of thing, then that she could be considered to be a kind of suppressive person for me.
That's right. Okay. And then PTS type 2 is when you have someone in your current environment who reminds you of a suppressive that you knew previously. And it's usually, well, the way they think about it is that it's an unknown. It's like you don't know that this person is reminding you of this past person.
Right. Sort of at a subconscious level.
Yes.
Right. So for example, if I ended up at some job where my boss had long black hair and was a woman and I don't know, liked red dresses or something, and somehow that reminded me subconsciously of my mom, who I grew up with, who's dead now, who suppressed me and who was all, beat me and was a very horrible person to me, then that would be a type 2 situation where the actual suppressive is my mom, but this boss person is reminding me or what they call in Scientology, re-stimulating the earlier suppressive because she looks and acts and, reminds me of her somehow.
Yes. And then PTS type 3 is... it's pretty much considered a parallel to a psychotic break. It's when a person feels like everyone in their environment is a suppressive person and they just curled up in a ball, terrified of the world. That's your type 3 person. Everyone around them is a suppressive person and they can't see straight past that.
Okay. That's pretty clear.
That one, just pretty straightforward, yes.
Yeah. And this sort of thing has occurred where people have gone into a psychotic episode or psychotic break during the course of receiving Scientology. Yes,
several times I've seen it. I mean, there's some that actually ended up on the Introspection Rundown, and there's others that have begged for the Introspection Rundown. You'll have people like staff members, and you're like, they need food and sleep more than anything else. You know what I mean? They're just deprived and they've lost, their grip on reality, and think that I've had people beg for the rundown, trying to, thinking this is the only hope for me, and still not being able to get it because it's difficult to get. So.
And when you say these people, are you referring mainly to Sea Org members?
Yes.
Right, because the Sea Org lifestyle and schedule sort of, lots of sleepless nights or very little sleep for extended periods of time, not great food, not a great working environment, extremely stressful, very anxiety inducing. So, I also, when I was heard about people who had psychotic episodes or psychotic breaks, and that sort of thing was hushed up, not talked about. They sort of disappear for a while. You just don't know where they went. Nobody talks about it. Hey, where's Joe? Oh, well, I don't know where Joe is, And then you find out through some sort of rumor line that, oh yeah, Joe's, being watched. Because what happens with somebody when that in a controlled environment of the bubble world of Scientology and the Sea Org, what happens to somebody when they have such a break? Do they call the paddy wagon? Do they send them to a mental institution? What do they do with them?
No, Scientology is very anti-psychiatry, anti-psychology, all of it. They believe that they have the answers for everything. And if somebody's in a state like that, then the correct technology has not been applied. That's how that goes. So they'll be put into an isolation situation. They'll be put under watch, and they'll do what you could call destimulation. You're just trying to get somebody who's in a very highly stimulated situation, isolate them out to get them to chill out. A lot of times they'll just try to get them food and sleep, vitamins, and just try to bring a person back to health that way. Sometimes they'll end up on this rundown. There's a lot of back and forth about whether locking people up is part of this rundown, a part of the introspection rundown. I'll just say that it happens often that they end up locked up, but it's not covered anywhere by Hubbard that says lock people up.
Oh, okay. That's an interesting point.
They are required to go into isolation, which we'll get into, but it doesn't actually say anywhere lock them up. The rundown is, he says Hubbard says that he did a bunch of research. He finished his research, quote unquote, and then now he's releasing this technical breakthrough. And from what we can tell, we looked at something online about this, and there was a man who was on the Apollo ship, which is the Sea Org ship that Hubbard was on. And there was a man, and he had what other crew members diagnosed as a nervous breakdown or a psychotic episode. In Scientology terms, he had gone PTS type 3. He had a crush on one of the ship's young women, and when he learned she was engaged, he went berserk. He got a butcher knife from the pantry and threatened to kill Hubbard and other members of the crew. There were no designated security procedures or personnel trained to handle such a case. It took 4 crewmen eventually to subdue him and wrestle him into a cabin in the how do you say that word? Forecastle?
Oh yeah, the forecastle. Yeah, the forecastle. The forecastle.
Forecastle, yeah. The storage area above the bow, away from most of the crew, where he screamed continuously. So they go on here talking about how he was locked away in this room. And, this is where it started. And
Could you go ahead and finish the whole thing? Because it's actually quite an interesting little story.
Oh, okay. There was a metal bed with a mattress and a metal cabinet, but he managed to, I'm leaving his name out on purpose,
yeah.
But he managed to tear them apart with his bare hands and shove the pieces through a porthole. A young Australian named Mark Winder, who eventually became the church's chief spokesperson, had just arrived aboard the Apollo and was given assignment of guarding his cabin. He sat on a trunk in the hallway listening to this man shouting, "Bring the Commodore here, I want the Commodore right now." Then he would yank on the door, which was locked, and lashed to the bulkhead with sturdy ropes. Several times, Rinder recalled, he beat up other members of the crew when he was escorted to the bathroom or given his meals. Hubbard saw his rampage as an opportunity to experiment with the problem of acute mental breakdown. Total silence was enforced on the deck so that he would have nothing to stimulate him. 3 times a day, Hubbard would write him a note asking about his well-being. We're going to talk about those notes because that's not what the notes actually say. His response might be, "You're the devil's incarnate. I'm going to enjoy plunging a knife into you." Hubbard would respond that he understood, and by the way, was there any special food that the chef could prepare for him? That is not how the notes go. But we'll talk about the notes. I think it'll end up being in the next video, though. In this way, the rage began to subside. He allowed an auditor to visit him each day. After 2 weeks, the door to his cabin was unlocked and he emerged serene and apparently cured. The introspection rundown was issued shortly thereafter. So you're saying you cure a person of a psychotic break in 2 weeks?
No, I don't think so.
I'm just going to say no to that.
Exactly.
No.
And this, but I want to stress from my own research on Hubbard's methods, that was par for the course for Hubbard. He would have a case history of 1, if he bothered to do a case study at all, before pushing out his methods of how to deal with or handle mental phenomena or mental illness. And so this was sourced, by the way, to Karen de la Carriere, who was on the ship at the time and is now a prominent critic of Scientology. And she tells that story. And of course, Mike Rinder has since, this was when he was, I think, something like 18 years old, his first days on board the Apollo. This is 1972, 73 time period. And of course, he has since left Scientology and is also a prominent critic of it. Okay, so that's sort of our background on where this comes from.
Yes, the first person that it was done on was locked up, and that's the story here. It's not covered specifically in the materials to do that. However, I mean, what are you gonna, I'm not saying to lock people up, I'm not saying that, but what do you do with somebody when they're threatening people's lives like that and you're on a ship?
Well, I mean, I would say that. I mean, that's what we do. That's not just what something Scientology does. I mean, mental institutions have locks on the doors. They have, it's a matter of safety and security for the individual himself and for those around him. And if you have an individual who is in such a state of rage and that they attack others blindly and insanely, you have to restrain such a person for public safety. And again, for their own safety as well. I'm not justifying by saying this Scientology locking people up. I don't think Scientology has any authority or know how to do such a thing.
Right.
They shouldn't be doing that. But I understand why Scientologists would turn to such a method in trying to apply Hubbard's methods here, where Hubbard says, isolate the person and make sure they're secure and in a place where there's going to be quiet and and that sort of thing. Well, of course they're going to end up doing something like that to the person, and rightly so. In the case of, I think we talked about this in the last video, the Tennessee facility where they had people locked up for months, and one of those people managed to finally get a phone and call 911, and the Scientologists involved were rightly prosecuted for criminal negligence and I think kidnapping or enforced wrongful imprisonment. So there's a line here. Context matters in what we're talking about, and the people who are carrying these things out, are they trained? Do they know what they're doing? Do they have results with what they're doing, or are they following L. Ron Hubbard's goofball instructions? So
right. And you can safely say that if you want to go ahead and try out Scientology and sign your life over on the affidavits, which do have on them, you got to allow us to do the introspection rundown on you if we need to. But if you're going to walk in there and try out Scientology, you may, depending on the circumstances, you may end up in a situation where you are locked up because that's what they need to do. It's not covered in the bulletins, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. I guess I can put it that way.
Good point.
Okay, cool.
So
okay.
So what's next? How do we roll into this?
That's the origins. That's the quote unquote research that we have available to us on. He spent 2 weeks with this one gentleman on the ship, and then wrote a really long bulletin on how to treat psychosis. Actually, specifically psychotic breaks. The rundown is specifically addressed for psychotic breaks.
Okay.
So here we go. Let's start at the beginning of this bulletin.
Yeah.
I've made a technical breakthrough which possibly ranks with the major discoveries of the 20th century. He is so bold. It is certainly the greatest advancement of 1973 and is now being released after a final wrap-up of research. It is called the Introspection Rundown. I think that pretty much explains itself. The purpose of the Introspection Rundown is to locate and correct those things which cause a person to fixate his attention inwardly on himself or his bank. Bank meaning the reactive mind, that's the accumulation of pictures in your mind, the negative ones. This rundown extroverts the person so that he can see his environment and therefore handle and control it.
Well, this is interesting. So Hubbard's basically breaking down what this thing is for and who it's for.
Yes. Research in 1970, the actual cause of psychosis was isolated as given in HCOB 28 November 1970, psychosis. We discussed that one pretty thoroughly before, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but he's basically saying you have to have those psychotic characteristics, and then we'll add a couple more things onto that, and that is the type of person who ends up in a psychotic break. So once you fix the psychotic break, you still have a psychotic person that needs more fixing beyond this rundown itself.
Okay, that's Hubbard's theory.
Yes, Hubbard's theory. In the ensuing years, this has been proven beyond doubt to be totally correct. But what is a psychotic break? Man has never been able to solve the psychotic break. In fact, human beings are actually afraid of a person in a psychotic break and in desperation turn to psychiatry to handle. Psychiatry, desperate in its turn without effective tack, resorts to barbiturates such as heavy drugs, ice picks, electric and insulin shock, which have killed the person and only suppress him. The fact remains there has never been a cure for the psychotic break until now.
And in all fairness, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, Hubbard had a point. I mean, there wasn't a lot being done for people who were having psychotic episodes or psychotic breaks in mental institutions either, except to lock them up, and sometimes in pretty dingy, horrible, awful conditions, and do some pretty barbaric things to them. My point has always been with psychiatry that was a while ago. That is not a current representation of what goes on, but Scientologists keep pushing this outdated, out of context, old idea of psychiatry as though that's still what's going on. And if you dive into what goes on in psychology and psychiatry, you find out that it's become a lot, it's much more civilized and understanding now than it used to be, and that's progress.
Yeah, I mean, there is a definite, we've talked about it in other videos as well, but there's a definite paranoia in Scientology about psychology and psychiatry, because they think, you get this idea, you're inside Scientology, you think that the psychiatrists are just, somebody goes into a hospital and the psychiatrist ends up there, you just picture them like this, another person that can disappear off the streets and nobody will know. And that's how Scientologists actually think.
And they think that because Hubbard made films for Scientologists, internal technical training films to train auditors that show exactly that. They have a film where they have a little girl come in who gets, thrown into this psychiatric facility, and they literally murder her right on film. It's a film. They didn't really kill this girl, but it's a representation of what Scientology says, psychiatry does. They murdered this little girl. And so that's what Scientologists think goes on. I used to think as a Sea Org member that the worst possible place I could end up, would be a psychiatric institution. I used to tell myself I would rather be in jail in Mexico than end up in a psychiatric hospital, right? It was that, and I had to, like I said, I had a lot of unlearning and learning newly what psychiatry is really all about in the modern day. After I got out of Scientology, to get my head clear of a lot of that. So,
I think nowadays you have, there's a lot of rules and laws in place that protect the patient far more than when Hubbard had written all this stuff. You don't just show up and get institutionalized, and they really think that. You're going to need to get an assessment. You have to get a second opinion. They don't, and they ask for your consent. They don't just put you in there, but the Scientologists believe that these people, they'll just take us without our consent and we'll be stuck there forever unless our hero friends from Scientology come and pull us out, because otherwise we're doomed.
Exactly.
That's the attitude.
Exactly. I actually had a close relation, not an immediate relation, but somebody that I know from somebody else that I know, recently checked themselves into, voluntarily committed themselves for a stay at a psychiatric institution and got nothing but help. Rest, calm, chill, no drugs. Actually helped this person to get off of some illegal drugs. And it wasn't a rehab facility, but this was just one of the things this person needed help with. And, after a short period, he left. All good, so it's not this picture of this one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of picture that Hubbard paints. Psychiatry changed with the times. Hubbard didn't, is really the bottom line on it.
Exactly.
All right, so go ahead and what else do we have in terms of what Hubbard says about this rundown here?
Okay, the key is what caused the person to introspect before the psychotic break. The breakthrough was made on a person who, after a series of wrong indications, went into a full-blown psychotic break, violence, destruction, and all. Okay, the psychiatrist at this point would have sharpened up his ice pick, filled his syringes with the most powerful and deadly drugs he could find, and turned up the volts. His handling would have been a final destruction of the individual. Okay, so Hubbard is saying here that he believes that the last reason for having psychiatry around is gone, and he says this rundown is what will fix anyone who is in a psychotic break. And then he's explaining the definitions of introspection and introversion, which I want to read out.
Oh, yeah. What does he say about that?
Okay, introspection, looking into one's own mind, feelings, reactions, etc., observations and analysis of oneself. And that's from the Webster's New World Dictionary. Introversion, a tendency to direct one's interest upon oneself rather than upon external objects or events. Same dictionary, Webster's New World Dictionary. So what this rundown addresses is what causes a person to look inwardly incessantly. It's natural, it's common for people to look in on themselves, do self-assessments, but when people do it obsessively, the idea is that this rundown would address the obsessiveness of it.
Okay, so that's why it's called the Introspection Rundown.
Yes.
Because the idea is the guy's looking inward to the exclusion of the outside world. He's totally inside his head and unable to see outward at all. Okay. And the purpose of the rundown is getting the person to stop looking inwardly and being able to look outward. That's actually signifies the completion of the rundown. It's only what we call the end phenomena for the rundown is that they're looking outward instead of in. And that's what the whole rundown is addressed towards. Okay, got it. Which doesn't particularly sound nefarious or horrible or awful.
No, it's just how you get there by locking somebody up, force feeding them, and
yeah, that's where things go really off the rails. Yeah. And keep in mind that folks who are doing this in Scientology have no other training than Scientology. These are not people who are necessarily college educated, have nothing in terms of medical training.
Yes, that's correct.
Which in the case of the biggest and most widely known case example of the introspection rundown is Lisa McPherson, who died in Clearwater, Florida in 1995, 96, 95?
95, December 95.
Yeah. And she was being handled by people who had very little medical background or training, as I understand it.
Yeah, I looked at those files, and I had done some work explaining those in a series that Tony did, where he was doing like a day-to-day what happened with her day by day leading up to December 5th when she passed away in 1995. I looked through those documents again, and there are some things. Since we're on it, I might as well go ahead and bring up the subject. She actually had, per the notes, first of all, it's difficult for me to say definitively what happened because we don't have all the files available to us. We just have the public records that are available, which isn't all the files. Right. Per those public records, she had an introspection rundown in July of 1995, and she completed the rundown. She was moved forward onto other services. which I believe is when Ms. Scavage was looking in on a session and saw that she had gone clear in that session, and then somehow that's how he got involved in it, from what I could tell. And so she gets to attest to the state of clear, and then soon after that ends up in a car accident where she takes off all of her clothes and says, "I need help." She ends up in a medical facility, and of course the Scientologists, concerned that the psychs are coming in, want to get her out of there. And comparing this rundown to what happened with her, she should have never left that doctor's office. Never. She was, even if she didn't get any psychiatric treatment, interviews, or anything, they still should have done a full physical workup on her at that time when she had that car accident. We don't know, you know, she passed away from a pulmonary embolism and dehydration. And I couldn't tell if it was from the car accident or if it was from, if the embolism was from the car accident or if it was from being in bed for how many weeks was it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That maybe we can say, we can't say with certainty that had she stayed at the hospital, the embolism would have been detected and dealt with. But we can say with certainty that there was zero chance that anyone in Scientology was going to isolate or detect that embolism and deal with it competently and with effective medical treatment. That we know for sure. And the tragic result of her dying is the direct result of Scientologists who had insufficient medical knowledge and understanding of what she was really suffering from, dealing with someone because they, you know, I hope we're making it clear that it's not because they wanted to kill her. It's not because they were evil. It's not because they had nefarious plans. It's because they are under this horribly false impression that medicine and psychiatry and any general medicine, as we covered in our last video, that those are the guys who are the barbarians and that they sharpen their knives and drug people with poisons and they don't know what they're doing. So the Scientologists who went and did this actually thought they were doing the right thing, and they could not have been more wrong. Right. But it was with good intention. Nobody, I've never questioned the intention of what they were doing. It's just the consequences of their ineptitude was truly tragic.
Yes, yes. And it's funny, when I was studying all the references on the Introspection Rundown, I was surprised to discover I couldn't find anything that said they're supposed to get a medical checkup, because all of the Introspection Rundowns that I have done have required it. We have had the person actually to the point where it's go to the doctor and get a diagnosis and don't come back until you have one. And then I dug around a little bit more and I found the reference in physically ill PCs and pre-OTs, the reference we had read about before.
Right, I was going to say, but there is this other reference that covers that.
The correct action on an insane patient is a full searching clinical examination by a competent medical doctor. He may find disease, fractures, concussion, tumors, or any common illness which has escaped treatment and become chronic. He should keep looking until he finds it. So you keep sending the person back to the medical doctor before you do any other step on this rundown. And it was required, like on the ones that I did, we couldn't move forward until they had a diagnosis and a treatment plan from a doctor. And another thing I was thinking of is in Los Angeles, which is where I was most of my time, we had the clinic, Shaw Health Center, which was a clinic that was manned by Scientology doctors. Dr. Dink and Dr. Shields were the primary ones. And, you know, we could go to them and say, hey, this person's they're in a psychotic break. We need the help here to fix this person. But did they have anything like that in Florida? I mean, they're sitting here passing all these hospitals because they don't want her to end up in psych.
Well, and yeah, because they ended up driving her to Mink, to Dr. to
Minkoff, yeah.
Minkoff. And he's a Scientologist.
45 minutes away.
That's right. And they passed all these other places that they should have and could have taken her to because they wanted to take her to the Scientologist, who was a doctor. And so that's
Right.
so yeah, they did have somebody there, but he was farther away than other facilities that they could have and should have used.
So they didn't have a clinic or anything, I guess, over there. I mean, because we
On the
had,
base
for
at
decades,
Clearwater?
we were spoiled. We were spoiled by having them. You know, like if I would have, well, not spoiled, but you know what
Yeah,
I
I wouldn't
mean,
use the word spoiled.
in the
I would say
Scientology term,
you had access to competent medical care, is what I would,
sort
you
of,
know.
yeah,
I mean, we might have considered in the Sea Org that we were spoiled. I mean, I get why you say that. To the
yeah,
rest of the world, they're gonna go, "Wow, you guys are, wow,
out of
that's
your
quite the
minds.
bubble world." Yeah. And I have no rationalization for it. We were a little out of our minds when it came to how we thought about
All of it,
medicine.
yeah,
And anybody who thinks that, well, you had doctors who were Scientologists, yeah, but they were Scientologists first and doctors second. So
yes,
they had gotten into Scientology after already having become doctors, bought into Hubbard's nonsense, and altered their application of medicine accordingly.
yeah,
That
and I
that
mean,
happens.
yeah.
You know?
So, you know, that's another aspect of it is, I mean, she should have never left the hospital,
Right.
or she should have been sent to a Scientology doctor, if nothing else, that day to really, you know, they never, from what I can tell, she never got a proper medical checkup.
Wow.
And that should have been done immediately. Yeah.
Things could have
Okay.
turned out very differently for her if they had.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, now
So
where am I?
what other points do we have here? We're going to be doing this video up to the point where we actually start the technical actions of the introspection rundown, and we'll be taking that up in our next and final video on this step. So here we're covering sort of these preliminary beginning basic steps. So what other points are there to this?
Okay. On the steps of the rundown, step 0 and 00 are for a person in a psychotic break, not a normal person. That's what it says.
A normal
Not
person.
a normal person.
Mm-hmm.
My snide laugh at
Hubbard.
Hubbard's words.
Yeah.
Okay, so here it says, on a person in a psychotic break, isolate the person wholly with all attendants completely muzzled, no speech. So this means that the people with that person are not allowed to talk at all. They don't say anything. And, you know, in the ones that I did, the person would be isolated. They were taken off Sea Org properties after Lisa McPherson passed away. No persons who needed this rundown were allowed on any Sea Org property. So the ones that I was involved in ended up being off property. They would rent a cabin in the middle of the San Bernardino Mountains, or they would go to an extended stay hotel, and I would be driven over there to do the sessions on the person every day. I'd go there and stay there all day and do really short sessions on the person. And when I wasn't doing sessions, nobody would talk to him. I was the only person that would talk to the person.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
What was your thinking at the time, not now, about the fact that suddenly it couldn't be done on base? It couldn't be done in the Scientology facility. It had to be done some external location. What were your thoughts on that at the time?
Well, I figured if the bulletin says isolation, I mean, the further you are away from this environment that stimulates you, the better. I mean, to tell you the truth, I was probably so overstimulated myself. I felt great going out to isolation. I had my own little peaceful moments there, you know, where I was away from it all too. I mean, there's
nice
something
to drive
about
away, yeah.
Yes, there was something about being in those areas with that high stress environment and just moving a person away from it. I think it did relieve stress, whether Hubbard wanted it to or not.
Right, fair enough.
So
my other question is this business about being muffled, right? Having zero communication or replying or answering or talking to the person. The idea here, if I understand this right, is because you don't want to further re-stimulate or stir up the person's thoughts or ideas or get them even in a worse state, right? That's the theory?
yeah, like any word you say could trigger them.
okay, you might trigger them. Okay, I get it. But on the other hand, I can't think of anything that drives me crazier than the silent treatment.
Right.
So I think there's, to have an absolute there of no talking under any circumstances, no matter what they say, no matter how much they plead, no matter what they're saying or doing, you must not say a word. I think that's a
extreme,
ill-conceived.
Yeah. I did, notice how they got around it with hand signals. If he said, I'm hungry, they would, get food for him. Or if he said, I forgot where the bathroom was, and you could point to it and stuff like that, but they didn't use words.
Right.
So,
right.
And then further into when they seem to be getting more rational, they'd start talking, but they're not allowed to start getting into stories and stuff, but if the person themselves asks a question, they'll answer the question, but that's about it.
Oh, okay. Later
Very
on.
limited communication. Yeah.
All right. Got it. Okay. But at the beginning, it's clamped down. It's an absolute rule. You shall not talk to them no matter what. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And, I had a couple of them where it's a big problem, and I see that happen also with Lisa McPherson, is a big problem to get sleep, to get them to sleep and eat. They just don't have, you don't have a proper setup to deal with somebody who's not sleeping and not eating. One of the first ones I was involved in, I was the medical person. I wasn't trained to do this rundown at all. I was one of the medical persons. And this guy, actually, the guy who got arrested in Tennessee, Denis Lamont, came up to me. I was the medical person at Celebrity Center, and he worked there too. And he told me this person was locked up. And I was like, what are you talking about? And there was this person in a psychotic state who was locked up in one of the Sea Org birthings in a closet in the dark. He was physically violent. Denis is a big guy. I don't know if you know him at all, but he was like an ex-hockey player, and he's a good, he's strong. So he was there to restrain the guy and keep him from hurting other people, and they'd have to open the door and try to give him food. The guy would attack people. And, he's like, I need some help. He's not sleeping at all. I need a doctor's prescription or something. So, I call up Dr. Shields trying to get a prescription for him. And she's like, well, I need to see him. And I'm like, well, good luck with that. Well, come on over. I can't bring him to you. But she ends up writing a prescription for him for some pills to try to get him to sleep. And he wouldn't take the pills. We tried to smash him up, and we hit him in the food. He could tell that they were there, and he wouldn't take them, and then she said, well, we can try this jelly for him. So we tried this jelly form of some kind of sleeping medication and put it in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and try to get him to eat it. And he just threw it back in our face. It's like, and I'm sitting here thinking,
this is where injections and sedatives and things come in a more professional environment.
Exactly. At least in that, Lisa is in the same state where she's not eating, and clearly she's becoming more and more dehydrated. Dehydration does not happen in 5 minutes. I mean, that's long. That's an extended period of time. If somebody ends up to where they die from dehydration, it's not a 5 minute, and
exactly.
The paranoia
and that's where
about
IVs
psychiatry.
And sedatives.
Yes.
This is why medical facilities and medically trained personnel are so important in dealing with this kind of situation. It's not some big bias for, pro pharma or big pharma or some nonsense. That's not at all the point. We're talking about very basic points here of how do you deal with someone who refuses to eat, will not sleep. I mean, these are big problems for somebody when you're outside of in a state like that. And if you're tasked with dealing somebody like that and you don't have any training and you don't know what to do and not do, you're going to come up with some pretty weird shit, and that's what ends up happening with these people is they get, you're locking somebody in a closet, you're using a lot of force on them, you're keeping them literally in the dark, I mean,
Yes.
that's crazy to treat anyone like that. That's called cruel and unusual punishment. It's literally a human rights violation and a constitutional violation of their rights in the United States. It's not the government doing it, so you can't say, well, you know, okay, fine, like legally speaking, we couldn't take him to task for that, but it's clearly a human rights violation.
Right. And it's not like anyone who is trying to help him is trying to they have the best intentions in mind, but they're just not they're not trained properly to you know, deal with somebody in a state or in a condition like this. It's like the people that I did this rundown on, at the end, I'm like, why am I, how am I qualified to fix? I mean, this is a serious state that a person is in. And I see them at the end and I'm like, you know, one of them, after he was done with the rundown, he was sent out of the Sea Org and he was sent back to his family, who I knew his dad. We put him on a plane from Los Angeles to Florida. And by the time the plane landed, the father was on the phone to me and said, "Who is this person? I don't know who this is. That's your son." And it's horrible and it's upsetting for me. It's like I've done this on people and I don't feel like I've helped them.
Right.
Because
well,
this rundown. Yeah. I thought I was.
I believe me, I understand how you feel.
So you go into this with the best intentions, thinking, "Oh, this is what Hubbard says is going to work," and you go through it all, and you're like, "Did that do anything? Did it make any difference? How is this person doing now? I don't know. I don't know how this person is doing now. Have it, you know?" And when I looked up psychotic breaks, just you know how psychiatrists deal with it. I mean, nowadays it does look like there is a lot of, you know, a lot of it is there's nothing forced about it. The person has a lot of rights and say so about their treatment, or at least a family member is. But once they're out of their psychotic break, they're like, they have a plan. The next step is the plan for the lifetime treatment of the condition. Lifetime treatment of the condition. And here we are, 2 weeks. Okay, you're better. See you later. Like that.
Exactly. Right? Because
all done.
And we'll probably get into this in the next video in terms of the afterness of all of this, but we can say right now, Scientology can't wash their hands of these people fast enough. As soon as they can put two sentences together and, you know, that sort of thing, it's like a gone.
See you later.
Goodbye.
Bye.
You know,
bye. Yes.
We don't want anything like that around us. And, you know, so again, if this group is going to bash, you know, the only group of people who are actually stepping up and willing to do something about it, which is psychology and psychiatry as subjects, you know, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health professionals, maybe I should put it that way. If they're just going to bash those people, and this is their only alternative solution.
Yeah.
You know, what are we talking about here? Now, of course, the other thing is if they're not kicking them out and sending them back to their family, that I was shocked to find out they do something even worse with them if they're Sea Org members. You want to lay this one on me here?
Yes. It says when a person is released from isolation after finishing the handling of the psychotic break, they get welcome back. And they'll put in the orders of the day, which is like a daily sheet that comes out to all Sea Org members saying, "Hey, welcome this person back." And then you ask them, "Do you want to stay or leave?" Now, this bulletin was written before Lisa McPherson happened and before she passed away. So these people were they were asked, "Do you want to stay or do you want to go?" Now, since Lisa McPherson, it's pretty much a given that they go. Unless, you know, that's one of those things where management policy, it could change. Right. So what Hubbard says to do is if a person out of a psychotic break wants to stay in the Sea Org, they are sent to the Rehabilitation Project Force. They have to make good.
Right, because they're such horrible people.
Yes.
So, you know, so just imagine the logic here. You are in this bubble of a bubble world. The highest stress, highest level of anxiety, pressure on you on a daily basis. You're not being well fed. You're not getting a lot of rest. a psychotic, and I will say, I will absolutely lay the blame for a psychotic episode in the Sea Org on the Sea Org, because its policies and its operating basis and its standard of living are disgustingly bad. So here, a person has that happen to them. They just flip. They get some kind of handling. They chill out. They go, well, yeah, I still want to clear the planet and save the universe and do the right thing, because this is what I was convinced to do is the only solution for mankind. Good. Well, the only way you get to stay is to go do the RPF. And
That's right.
if that's not like a direct invitation to go have another psychotic episode, I don't know what is, because
Right.
when I landed on the RPF, I was about as close to having such an episode myself as I have ever been. It was the toughest, most difficult, most I don't even have the words to describe my mental state in the first month that I was on the RPF, but I was not in a good place. And it
Right.
took a lot of work to get me over that, and I did it myself. It wasn't because anybody helped me through it.
Right.
So,
So
so
this
I look at that and
RPF
I just go, RPF, holy fucking shit, that is insane. Pardon my
Right.
French, but wow. I did not know that until you pointed that out to me the other day.
Yeah. And this is straight out of the bulletin. So you sit here, you just imagine this person has had a psychotic break. Whether they got locked up or not, the lockup, which I think we've covered, is
Yep.
is when they're dangerous. It's up in the air. I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I don't particularly endorse something like that. I don't think it's okay. But here you
I
have
don't
this
endorse
person.
Scientologists doing it. I'll tell you.
Right.
I think I've made
They
that
don't know
clear.
what they're doing. Right.
Exactly.
So you have this person, they've been isolated. They're in a muzzled situation where no one can talk to them. The only person that talks to them is the case supervisor through these letters that we're going to talk about, which are vicious and mean. That comment about them being nice letters, they are not. We'll talk about those letters, but they're vicious and mean because the case supervisor is trying to pull the person out of their head. But the letters, so you're getting these vicious letters from your case supervisor. The only person that will talk to you and be nice to you is the auditor who's doing your sessions, which are very short sessions. So you finally brighten up and you feel better and you're like, okay, I'm back. I'm ready to go start clearing the planet. And now you're going to be you're going to be wearing black. You're going to be not allowed to talk to anyone. You're not allowed to be around your spouse. If you're married, you cannot see your children. You have 5 hours a day of hard labor, if you're lucky. Some are 10 hours a day of hard labor. Auditing sessions are going to be talking about all your harmful acts to other people and, trying to figure out what your evil purposes are underneath that. And you're addressing this for years. You do an introspection rundown for 2 weeks. You go to this program for years and beg to come back into the Sea Org after you're done. That's what you get to do. Please let me come back. I'm clean. I'm good now.
Yeah, I swear I'll be good from here on out. I'll never do anything wrong ever again.
Until tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Until I have to do something else for Scientology because they are compromising my moral compass.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well,
I felt like that was an important point. So
no, absolutely it is. I'm glad you brought that up. And like I said, that was something I needed to learn. I did not know that. So yeah, this is, we've surveyed sort of some fundamentals and some beginning rudimentary steps of the introspection rundown. The actual steps we'll get into as far as like what happens when the auditor goes in and does these sessions with the person. What are these letters about? How long until the person can start being talked to again? That's what we're going to cover in our final video on this. It's going to be pretty technical. We're going to do our best to be interpreting a lot of Scientologies in that video. But I think we've definitely gotten some points across here between this and the earlier videos in this series that Scientologists are the least professional people you ever want to have anything to do with when it comes to dealing with mental illness or treating mental disorders. And that's what we're trying to get across here. And they think, because Hubbard tells them otherwise, that they're the only ones who have any solutions for this, and they are tragically wrong.
Right. So think twice before you sign up. Exactly.
Because you mentioned this earlier. I want to highlight this as the last step here. when you go into Scientology and you start receiving auditing at any Scientology organization anywhere in the world at any level, they're going to have you sign a document that specifically states as one of its conditions that you give Scientology the right to come get you if you have some kind of a psychotic episode, whether it was caused by Scientology or whatever. If you end up in a hospital or you end up in a situation where you're having an episode, you sign this document that gives the Scientologist the right to come collect you and treat you with this kind of treatment. And that is definitely something you should be thinking 2, 3, 4, and 5 times about before putting pen to ink or pen to contract on any such thing. So, okay, Sunny, thank you very much for taking the time and going over some of this stuff with me and everybody here. I hope people are finding this informative and educational, probably not super entertaining, but the purpose of this is definitely education more so. So thanks for coming around and watching this, guys. Go ahead and leave any comments on this in the comment section below. I've also put links to Tony Ortega's article on this that Sunny contributed to in the description below. You can check that out for a sort of a day-by-day, blow-by-blow breakdown of what happened with Lisa McPherson specifically. So you can get the rundown on that and how this introspection rundown plays into that and was part of her story. Talk to you guys next week. Bye-bye.